They crested the ridge and saw something no commander from the eastern steppes had ever seen: a ring of stout wooden palisades set against a raised earthen berm, like a piece of Italy plunked into the middle of Central Asia. From that height, the fortress looked alien: rows of spear points, interlaced timberwork, towers for archers, and behind the walls there moved an orderliness that did not belong to the region's usual mix of horse archer skirmishers and light infantry. Men moved in disciplined lines, shields locked, a formation that to a trained eye was unmistakable: Roman. For 17 years, the world had whispered about a mass of captured Romans carried off after the disaster of Carrhae. Histories called them lost, empires trusted rumors, and then in 36 BC, a Han reconnaissance party on the fringe of empire saw a lone fact that resolved the mystery: a tight drill, repeated motions, a testudo-like array, a smoking gun that suggested those veterans of Western wars had not simply vanished. They had been repurposed, transplanted, put to work where the Parthian court thought them harmless. That sight would force empires to decide what to do with other people's soldiers, and would drag one ambitious Han commander across deserts and mountains to answer a question no one thought to ask sooner: what happens when Roman discipline meets Han fire? To understand how those Romans came to sit behind a timber wall on the far edge of the Iranian plateau, we must travel back to the plains outside Carrhae in 53 BC. Marcus Licinius Crassus, boundless in wealth and aching for military glory, marched east with legions that had fought across Gaul and Spain. He carried with him not just troops and standards, but an appetite for honor commensurate with his fortune. Against him rode a Parthian system that rejected heavy massed infantry as a solution, and instead perfected a different kind of war: mobile strike, feigned retreat, and the merciless rain of arrows from horse archers. Behind those riders thundered the cataphracts, armored heavy cavalry who could break shields with a single charge. The Roman response was trained and stiff. They tried to force a battle on terms they understood. But on that field near the Euphrates, the great iron discipline of Rome met a tactic it had rarely seen: patient annihilation. Horse archers came at range. The Parthian line never offered itself for sustained hand-to-hand, and the Romans, tied to their formations, were picked apart. When the dust settled, sources tell us the slaughter was terrible and the survivors few. Many fled, many died. Thousands more, estimates vary and must be treated cautiously, fell into Parthian hands. Pliny the Elder, writing later, records that thousands were taken captive. Some ancient lists, repeated by later chroniclers, speak of a figure in the many thousands, a number that in modern retellings has been rounded or amplified.
What matters is this: a substantial body of trained Roman soldiers, hardened to discipline, suddenly existed beyond the reach of Roman command. Now imagine the calculations inside the Parthian court. A victor does not always know what to do with skilled prisoners. Kill them and you waste talent. Feed and guard them and you invite revolt. Integrate them and you risk cultural friction. The Parthians chose a third path: put the captives to use, but not where they could easily threaten heartlands. They marched many of the Romans east, across deserts and river basins, into the oasis lands of Margiana, those emerald pockets of water and date palms in an otherwise harsh landscape. Margiana's main urban center, referenced in late antique sources, and likely the place later called Merv, sat at an imperial crossroads. There, in the liminal borderlands, the captives could be set to work as garrison troops on a frontier the Parthians needed to hold against steppe raiders and restless satraps. Frontier life for a once Roman cohort would have been a study in adaptation. Thirst and heat supplanted the damp winters of Italy. Camel caravans replaced Mediterranean triremes. Perso-Hellenistic local customs met Latin drills. Archaeology and textual hints suggest many captives were enlisted as a professional corps, turned into guardians of irrigation works, watchmen of caravan routes, and the violent peacekeepers of oasis towns. Some married local women and settled into a hybrid existence. Language shifted, equipment changed, yet the essence of their training, coordinated movement, shield discipline, drills repeated until reflex, did not disappear. If anything, it became a fixed advantage. A cadre of veteran infantry, experienced in formation fighting, was attractive to any local potentate wanting a reliable bulwark. Which brings us to the fortress that astonished the Han scouts. Its name appears in scattered records with variants: Shang Chanu, Gigi Chanu, and other spellings, so the exact local form is murky. What survives across fragments and later chronicles is the description of a fortress unlike most on that frontier, a compact earthen rampart ringed by a heavy wooden palisade. The design was practical in a place where stone was costly, and timber, when available, could be assembled into formidable obstacles. Towers rose at intervals to serve crossbowmen or archers. Gates were stout and few. But what truly made the fortress stand out was not masonry but manpower, a professional nucleus of soldiers who drilled like legionaries. Local sources hint that this commander, a warlord who had once bested his own kin to seize control, had hired the Romans or allowed them to remain as his military corps, trading their service for pay, spoils, and a place to settle. For the commander, seasoned infantry provided the solidity his horsemen lacked. For the captives, a chance for pay and purpose beat desert exile.
Across the intervening years, news of these men's existence did not reach Rome in anything like a formal way. Regional gossip and the warped channels of imperial communication meant that those veterans were effectively erased from Western memory. Yet in the East, their presence shaped calculations. Merchant routes found protection where a reliable square of shield-bearers kept raiders at bay. Local governors slept easier with veteran infantry in the gates, and a fortress in marginal lands could be a pivot on which larger contests turned. The Hand Court came to know about the fortress through the routine intelligence of frontier commanders. Among them was Chen Tong, as later chronicles render him, a man born into modest circumstances who learned more from the map than from patronage. Chen Tong had spent his career on the edge, the kind of officer trained to appreciate logistics, draft animals, the trustworthiness of allies, and the lethal attention paid to crossbow crews. When news reached him of an oddly defended stronghold in the west and rumors of Roman veterans under its walls, he recognized two things at once: a military problem and a political opening. Imperial policy demanded caution. Sending a large imperial force required an edict, time, and bureaucratic assent. Chen Tong judged that delay would let a local warlord consolidate a power base. That would complicate any future attempt by the Hand to control the corridor. So he made a gamble that historians later called audacious, and his contemporaries called treasonous in tone, if not always in letter. With the backing of several frontier garrisons and allied Western auxiliaries, Kongju nobles and local levies, he forged an edict in the emperor's name. The risk was immense. If the forgery were discovered, it would be treason. But Chen Tong calculated that action and speed could produce victory and later absolution. He would mobilize a force and march across desert, river, and mountain to bring the fortress to terms. The logistics of that march are a feat in themselves. The route from Han garrisons to the Margina Basin crosses a geography designed to punish overconfidence: the Taklamakan's shifting sands, river systems that swell unpredictably, and high passes that demand careful planning for supply trains. Contemporary accounts, later chroniclers, and inferred distances suggest this was a long-range operation, measured in thousands of kilometers by some reconstructions, pushing men and animals to the edge. Chen Tong collected crossbowmen, shield troops, some cavalry, and allied contingents who knew the region. He left nothing to improvisation. Water sources were scouted, forage collected, and the march timed to avoid the worst weather hazards. When they finally reached the ridge opposite the fortress in 36 BC, what the Hand scouts reported back was more than timber and turf. It was an organization that moved in ways Roman manuals prized: short, repeated drills, disciplined shield work, men who assembled into rectangles and then into compact hedges of steel. For officers schooled against steppe tactics, the sight was startling. The testudo, the tortoise formation, where shields interlock to provide cover, had evolved among Roman infantry because it solved certain battlefield problems. To see echoes of that practice in an oasis fortress suggested a living lineage of training rather than accidental mimicry. Chen Tong knew what it meant. These were experienced soldiers showing doctrine, not mere local militia imitating Roman style for show. The siege that followed mixed improvisation with professional tactics. The Han could not simply bash the gate. The palisade and bank provided a first line of defense, and the defenders deployed in disciplined ranks. Chen Tong's advantage lay in combined arms. The Han army's crossbowmen, many of whom were trained to deliver massed volleys with terrifying accuracy at close range, were brought forward to soften the palisade and harass those assembled behind it. Shield-bearing storm troops marched in coordinated advances. Small teams of sappers and fire carriers sought to set the timberwork alight. Local auxiliaries probed the walls, looking for weak spots. And Chen Tong's cavalry, denied the room to wheel outside the walls, hovered to exploit any breakout attempts. Within the fortress, the Roman-trained corps reacted with the habits of their old profession.
When arrows and bolts came, they locked shields in concert. In a defensive posture, they could present an impenetrable face to frontal missile fire. In attack, their drills allowed them to move as one. For a moment, the battle looked like physics played over centuries. The Han's firepower attempting to erode cohesion, the Roman muscle trying to maintain the geometry of defense. The palisade, however, exposed a weakness. Timber burns. In a dry season, tinder is everywhere. Flames licked channels of wind, and aided by incendiary devices and deliberate placement of fuel, the wooden wall took fire. Towers, so useful for defenders, became flaming ladders. As smoke thickened, another hazard emerged for the defenders: cavalry. Once the palisade lost its integrity, mounted forces could approach with less fear of concentrated missile fire. Chen Tong used his horsemen to harry sorties, to prevent the defenders from forming up into coherent counterattacks, and to isolate strongpoints. The veteran infantry who had once trained under Roman discipline now faced a new synthesis of threat: dense, accurate crossbow fire at range, and a Han tendency to mix arms rather than rely solely on any single corps. The Romans' ethos of holding the line clashed with the practical calculus of survival.
In the end, the fortress fell not because the Romans failed to hold their shape, but because the combination of fire, disciplined ranged volleys, and mobile threats broke the very environment that allowed shield tactics to dominate. Xiang Chanu, call him what you will in the fragmentary records, fell in the final fighting. His death removed a focal point of resistance. The remaining defenders were captured or slaughtered. Those taken prisoner included men whose shields still bore traces of Western manufacture, whose drills matched patterns taught in legionary manuals, and whose presence at the fortress offered the decisive piece of evidence that solved the old riddle. These were the remnants, or at least the descendants, of the soldiers carried off after Carrhae. What made the discovery decisive for later historians was not only their material culture, but the behavior of the troops. A lone formation repeating tandem moves told a story of institutional memory. Soldiers pass habit through instruction. When a unit retains particular collective motions across decades, it speaks to a preserved martial culture. For scholars and commanders alike, seeing Roman-style drill on the eastern frontier changed prior assumptions. The West's military influence had traveled farther, and Parthian decisions to staff frontiers with prisoners had created durable pockets of Western practice. Numbers in ancient accounts are slippery. Some reconstructions place the captured at around 10,000, others treat the figure as a rough, possibly inflated estimate. Pliny, cited in some of the surviving accounts, notes mass captures and uses numbers in ways that modern readers must treat with caution. It is safer to say that a significant force, many thousands according to some ancient witnesses, entered Parthian custody, and that enough of these men survived service to create a military corps in Margiana. The Han engagement in 36 BC then revealed that corps in a way that the West had forgotten. The aftermath of the siege operated on several levels. For Chen Tong, the immediate result was paradoxical. He had acted without imperial authorization, forging an edict to mobilize a campaign. That gamble produced victory and the glory of having neutralized a potential threat to Han's supply lines. But politics under an emperor is a complicated ledger. Some officials praised his decisiveness, others denounced the deceit. Records suggest his career swung between approbation and censure, and later inscriptions and annals preserved both the praise and the cautions about overreach. Whether Chen Tong's treasonous act would be excused because it had worked, or punished because it set a dangerous precedent, became a point of internal debate in the Han court, a reminder that military success does not always translate into political security. For the captured Romans and their descendants, the fortress siege offered a grim closing of a certain chapter. Some were killed. Others were taken into Han custody. A few may have been integrated into local garrisons under Han authority, or quietly dispersed into frontier society. Their presence, at least for a time, helped shape the military and social landscape of Margiana. They became a living testament to the complicated outcomes that follow when one empire's prisoners become another's instruments. There is a broader lesson to be read into the episode, one that echoes in military histories across eras. Static defenses, however imposing, are vulnerable to the combination of superior firepower, mobility, and ingenuity. The palisade had been a rational choice in many contexts, and a ring of wooden stakes can be devastating when combined with disciplined infantry within. But timber burns, supply chains fail, and when the attackers assemble combinations of capabilities, crossbows to suppress, sappers to undermine, cavalry to exploit breaches, the rigid advantage slips away. Equally, the story shows the danger in underestimating people shifted by defeat. Prisoners resettled for convenience can become foundations for later resistance or tools for regional rulers.
A policy meant to neutralize a threat created a new, latent form of military competence on a contested frontier. We are also left with a human question. What did those captives think as they trained pillars of a foreign lord? Did they imagine home? Did they find small satisfactions in a stable garrison life, marriage, gardens, the daily certainties of watch rotations and rations? Or did they dream of the standards in Rome, of a life they had been forced to abandon? The sources do not preserve private thoughts. We can only reconstruct a plausible range of responses: adaptation, resignation, pride and professionalism, or quiet despair. The historian's task is to respect that gap with humility rather than to fill it with romantic fantasy. Finally, what do we make of the title with which this tale often travels, The Lost Roman Legion? The phrase captures the imagination because it names a mystery: veteran soldiers removed from their native theater, alive and organized in a distant land, carrying a form of military culture that, when finally seen, answered questions about the eastward fate of Rome's soldiers. The discovery at the fortress in 36 BC is the clearest piece of evidence historians have to tie those threads together. It did not restore the lost legions to Roman command, it did not replay the standards back into the Senate's care, but it did prove that the effects of Carrhae's disaster were not limited to a single battlefield. They rippled across deserts and decades, producing an unexpected encounter between Rome's discipline and Han firepower. History rewards close observation, patience, and caution before claiming certainty. The campaign that ended at the wooden palisade was a collision of cultures and innovations: Parthian mobility, Roman discipline retooled for a frontier, and Han combined arms ingenuity.
It reveals how empires manage prisoners, how local leaders exploit available assets, and how a single formation, seen from a ridge, can rewrite what scholars have assumed for generations. Cheng Tang's forged edict, his willingness to risk imperial wrath for the sake of speed, crystallizes the theme. Ambition, whether Crassus in the West or Cheng Tang's in the East, pushes men into decisions that reshape borders and human lives, for better or worse. So the Lost Legion was not a single unit marching back home to trumpet and triumph. It was a scattered, repurposed legacy of discipline and training that survived in the most unlikely of places. Its final chapter at the fortress in Margiana closed a long-standing question and left a set of larger questions in its wake. What would you have done if you were inside those timber walls? Hold formation under crushing missile fire, trusting ritual order and experience, or attempt a breakout that might save some and doom others? The tactical choices of those defenders remain a rich subject for debate. If this story of empire, discipline, and the strange afterlives of captured soldiers drew you in, subscribe for more deep dives into legendary clashes and forgotten corners of ancient history. What do you think was the smarter move for those Romans on the fortress steps? Stand in formation and rely on discipline, or gamble everything on a breakout? Leave a comment with your take. The best arguments might change how we imagine that ridge, that palisade, and the men behind the shields.